Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Heavy Thoughts. I'm Peter Pinto.
I'm Jennifer Davis.
And this is FitLife Fusion here in Las Vegas. What we have for you today is something a little bit different because in the past we've had discussions, we've done a lot of Q&As, but today what we've done is we watched a documentary called What the Health. It's something that's been making waves through the fitness community, and somebody said, hey, well, a lot of people have said, hey, you should really check out What the Health. It's this new documentary on Netflix. So Jen and I we checked it out. And what it was about it was another health documentary talking about everything that is wrong with food and the pharmaceutical industry and a lot of the stuff that we talk about. Now, if this is your first time tuning into Heavy Thoughts, what we want to disclose to you is Jen and I follow a lot of the principles, a lot of the work that Dr. Ray Peat, who is a physiologist, a biologist, has put out there via several books and probably well over 1,000 articles nowadays. Now, you can find information out about him at raypeat.com, RAYPEAT.com, and we're not trying to be representatives of Ray and his work, but we do follow his work. I've tried a whole bunch of things prior to Ray, from paleo to perfect health diet to Atkins and all of that. And Jen has her own history with diets, which
I went from anything to just doing the rice diet to being vegetarian, vegan, to just eating raw, sprouting
the rice diet.
The rice diet.
The water diet. Just pick one food
yeah.
and then put diet behind it, and then I'm sure there's a diet out there.
Rice and broccoli.
Cabbage diet.
Cabbage.
There is a
cabbage.
cabbage.
There is
a cabbage.
Yeah.
So I took some notes, and I have my notes right here. Jen has her notes over there too, and I figured we'd just kind of break it down a little bit. Now, the video starts off, and they're discussing diabetes, right?
Yeah.
Now, the cool part, we really had our hopes up. And if you haven't watched this yet, then we're going to spoil everything for you, because we're going to talk about everything in as much detail as possible. They started talking about how diabetes is not caused by sugar.
Yeah, and I was really excited. I was like, oh my gosh, they're saying, like you said, you're like, they're saying it.
We were
and I
like,
was
wait, what's happening right
yeah.
now, right?
Yeah, and then they were talking about, I was a little leery, they talked about how it's the fat that's hardening the cells. I wish that they would have specified what type of fat, but they're not going to. So yeah, I was really excited, and because they were very passionate that it wasn't because of carbs.
At least for the first 5 minutes or so. So they didn't put a lot of time into this, but they did start off at least by saying it's ridiculous to think that diabetes is caused by a large carbohydrate consumption, right? Diet. And then they go on to say that it's the fat in the diet that causes an inability of the proper utilization of sugar. So we eat all of the sugar, whatever, in the diet of any kind, because they didn't really specify. They just said sugars and starch. And then what happens is the fats that are in the American diet, that are all over the place, as they continue to say, are what are making it so that the sugar can't get into our cells, the cells cannot use them, and then therefore they start malfunctioning. Mm-hmm. Right? So for the first 5 minutes, I
was getting all excited. I was like, I can't wait to show this person and this person. And then when they weren't specifying things, and then they really started talking about meat, red meat specifically, I was like, this is starting to get a little shady. It was very broad, which most documentaries on diet and health, they get like that. Mm-hmm. And
meat was meat in this video. I mean, they started with the red meats, they started going on about cows and livestock, and they gradually got into chicken and pork and sandwich meat, and really then all of a sudden you could tell that we were in for a 2-hour vegan commercial.
Yeah. I wish that they would have, because when I was vegan, I read the China study, and I did
Jen
a lot
was
of
vegan.
things. It's true that a high red meat consumption, or if you have that, or high red meat
High in
diet,
red meat.
it is acidic. But they don't talk about let's just make this balanced and eat it with other foods, because they're approaching it from, if you were like a paleo or what's the guy, the high meat guy, the Dr. Atkins.
Oh, Atkins, right,
Atkins.
right.
It's like meat. They're cramming like a buttload of protein down your throat. And it's like, no one really talked about balance. Because if there's moderation, it's fine.
Just hopping right into the whole red meat thing, something that Ray talks about, Dr. Ray Pete, is how we have, more recently too, especially in America, we've evolved from eating the entire animal and moved into just eating muscle meats, right? Because the textures of the more gelatinous and fattier pieces, or tendon and tripe and organ meat, we just have lost our taste for it. And that's happened more or less in the U.S. over the last 100 years. So now all we're eating is muscle meat. So it doesn't matter if it's necessarily red meat or if it's chicken or poultry. We're always eating muscle meat, and there's a very similar amino acid ratio to muscle meat, regardless of the animal. It does differ; it's not identical, but it has higher amounts of tryptophan, cysteine, and methionine, which Ray goes on to saying, well, without enough, or having too much of those three in abundance in the body can become inflammatory.
Yeah.
So he always talks about using gelatin, collagen, as a protein supplement, or
I like to call it even a buffer to deal with all the amino
Right.
acids,
Right, which has glycine in it, which then allows to, for us to have a ratio of amino acids that we're more accustomed to digesting.
Yeah.
I think Ray actually talks about 1 tablespoon of powdered gelatin can offset the inflammation caused by a serving of red meat.
Yeah.
And so that's what I at least try to stick with. I just throw it in my coffee.
Yeah, and I was when I was vegan and I started introducing meat again, I was really leery. But what I appreciated about learning how much protein your body needs, you're not consuming like 10 ounces of meat. I mean, it's only like when I have steak now, I mean, it's probably like 4 ounces.
Right.
I make sure that I have a carb with it and then a saturated fat. If I'm going to do like a baked potato and a steak, I'm going to have butter on it to help me process the starch. Everything is balanced. And they would use examples of countries around the world, like who had a high meat diet or a high dairy or milk diet,
Mm-hmm.
and they were saying that they had certain issues. And
Right, higher rates of heart disease and cancer.
And I don't know, it's just, they would just spout off those facts, but they didn't really break into like what the study was on. I was telling Peter earlier, I said most of these countries too, they've started to adopt a more westernized way of eating. Like McDonald's and fast food is more prevalent in these countries now, so that's going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. They didn't, you don't really get a detailed look at the study and what the focus was on.
Right. I mean, they were just like a lot of other documentaries. They found studies that really worked well with their story, because remember, a documentary, it's a story, it's a movie. So they have to entertain. They have to keep you, they have to string you along from one phase to the next in the story, right? So they're making a claim, and then they start bringing about all of this research that is going to help support the point that they're trying to make. So they did have they made some good points, at least gave some things to think about, right? I always look at these things as, okay, of course there's so many variables that they're not even taking into consideration. They have this very general, claim and all of these studies that, they found on here, PubMed, or, the American Association of Science and all of this. And then some of the statements that they make, though, at least by saying, yes, going from eating shit foods like McDonald's and lunch meats and all of these other processed foods that, they were showing video of the chickens being pumped with,
antibiotics,
salt water and antibiotics, things like that, trying to make them heavier and plump them up. And of course, if you go from a diet that yes, might be a meat-heavy diet, supposedly. And all of those food options are crap.
Are filled with
right
antibiotics and probiotics,
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's hard to even think like, okay, well, how do I really avoid them? How can I really trust anyone? I try to go to local butcher shops, and if you find a butcher that is actually part of the Butchers Guild, they know where that animal came from, etc. Now, could pollution in the air have finally rained down onto the grass that these pasture-raised cows are eating? Yeah.
Yes. But it's still low.
Right, there's pluses and minuses to everything. Mm-hmm. So I will at least go with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I guess let's go down the list a little bit. Yeah. They start off by, again, talking about how everything is processed and processed meat equals cancer. They talk about, first of all, the narrator was a former hypochondriac who came from a family of, a lot of sickness and cancer and heart disease. And then he moved on to start interviewing a guy named Dr. Neil Bernard. And he's a cardiac, right? Mm-hmm. Cardiologist. And he's the one that starts talking right off the bat about how diabetes is not caused by sugar, it's caused by fat. Now, as we know, the entire, heart association, really everything that cardiologists and surgeons are taught comes from the old, what is it called? The heart health theory, right? Where diets high in fat have a lot of cholesterol. Diets, a lot of cholesterol equates to a lot of blood cholesterol, which then clogs arteries and creates heart disease, right? So they're coming from this point of view, which we already know has been disproven as early as the 1930s. So there's that. So that's kind of why we take this entire thing with a grain of salt after hearing, that. And every time they brought up a doctor who was a cardiologist.
I think at that point I just put my pen down.
I'm not going to take many more notes. I'm just going to listen. They go on to clump all of this together. Meat, dairy, eggs, pork, chicken, sandwich meat, McDonald's, Egg McMuffins, all of it together. Which then I was like, that's not really fair.
It's not really, well, and that's kind of what I was bringing up before. It was like everything was in excess. If you're eating tons of chicken, if you're eating tons of meat, if you're eating tons of this, it's going to do this. And I'm like, but that's not how everyone eats. And it's just not what you do.
Yeah. Are there cultures, here within the States where people do really eat like that? Yeah. But most of the time when we're working with people and we finally get them to journal, because not always is that an easy task, but we get them to journal, and I don't know about you, Jen, but a lot of the time I'll find that people are, especially women, they're at like 700 calories a day.
Yeah.
And they think they're eating a lot. So that right there, 700 calories, and I would say 30 grams to 50 grams of protein is what I would see. I would say 50 to 60 grams on the high end. And Ray discusses how 80 grams is probably minimum for just full-grown woman. So being a man with more body mass could be higher.
Yeah.
And their claim was 30 to 40 grams is probably what a person needs.
I was like, what? There was a doctor on there that's what he eats.
Right. Yeah, I don't... a lot of these doctors who they were also interviewing, they were all vegan themselves. Every one of them. So they really made sure they kind of pushed that point home, that every one of them, they're doctors, they're intelligent, they're healthy, and they're vegan.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I was like, oh, shit. Right. Moving on to the next point. People who have one serving of lunch meat have a 51% higher chance of heart disease, death from heart disease, right? Mm-hmm. All these statistics that they were throwing out there. They did make a lot of cholesterol mistakes, I think. We already know, it's been disproven so many times that how much cholesterol is in the diet doesn't necessarily equate how much dietary cholesterol to how much blood cholesterol there is. Okay, and mind you, cholesterol is made from sugar. So I'm not entirely sure how. I mean, I know how, right? Because it's been driven home. The medical industry itself is and has been sponsored by food industry since the 20s and 30s. So Jen's having a tough day with
this video was really tough, and partly because I used to watch videos and read books that had this common thread or attitude all the time. And I remember feeling confused and like without hope when I would read and watch these, and then I took that on again when I watched that, and it was just kind of discouraging, and I was just like, ugh. You know, that's why I appreciate Ray Peat so much, because he's not someone that says, hey, this is my diet, you know, prophesy my diet, or, you know.
Yeah, he doesn't call anything that he does a diet.
Yeah, he's strictly just saying this is what the body needs, this is how it works, and take what you will from that, you know. And I like that. It's a lot more balanced, rather than I felt like they were demonizing dairy again. And I just know now I have enough years underneath my belt of eating meat and eating dairy and seeing how well I'm doing eating those things. So when I watch movies or documentaries like that, it's very conflicting and it's very frustrating, because I'm like, well, I actually have gotten healthier by eating more milk.
Yeah. And some people would hear you say that and say, oh, well, that's just anecdotal information and, you know, it's not worth anything. But we've had dozens, if not hundreds, of people that we work with, and we help reintroduce dairy into their diet, even if they've had it out of their diet for a long time. And it really can help. Then there was another statistic in there talking about how countries with more and more dairy or higher and higher dairy consumption have some of the greatest instances of osteoporosis.
I didn't understand that at all.
I just don't know where those numbers come. Like, I would love to see where, you know, they're really getting these statistics. But again, Ray would say along the lines, something along the lines of, well, there's calcium which you need, and if you don't consume calcium from things like bone broth and milk, then there's going to be a point in time where your body's going to need it for cellular function, and so it's going to reference it from your bone. So
is that one of the other things is
that what's going on? Maybe there's a lack of vitamin K, which is what mobilizes calcium in the body, right? So if there's a lack of vitamin K, it doesn't necessarily matter how much calcium you're getting in. You're just not going to be able to utilize it as well without having its mobilization.
But I was annoyed about when they brought up the whole lactose intolerance thing, because the more reading I'm doing, it's like when someone is lactose intolerant, that's a symptom of inflammation, and they took that as, they almost treat it as like it's a disease or a major health issue, and they're like, oh my God, you know, don't stay away from dairy, you're lactose intolerant. And it's really a symptom of other problems, and it's like, okay, so what's going on with their nutrition to begin with that's making them lactose intolerant? Like, no one looks at that.
And lactose is a sugar, right?
Right.
And it needs to be metabolized by an enzyme, lactase. And your body really only makes enough enzymes to deal with the things that you're eating on a daily basis. So if you're not a dairy type of person, over time, your body's not going to be making as much the lactase enzyme.
Well, they brought up China. Like, China was one of the highest, or Asia was one of the highest countries to have, you know, lactose intolerance.
So something like 95% of all Asians.
I'm like, well, do they consume a lot of dairy? I know that maybe in the country they might bring on some dairy, but that's not a country that really would deal with a lot of dairy to begin with.
Native Americans, same thing. 70% of all Native Americans are lactose intolerant. But again, if it's not a historically relevant food to a culture, then yes, they physiologically won't make as much of the stuff to metabolize that type of. Like, if somebody goes off of meat for a long time and then reintroduces it back into their body, they are not making the same amount of enzymes to digest the proteins that you would get from meat. So
yeah, I mean, I was vegan
they feel like
for
shit.
about a year and a half, or off and on for like 2 years. I was vegan for a year solid, and then I would bounce between being a vegetarian and vegan for about a whole other year. So when I was vegan, I felt great. I thought I did anyway, and I ran a lot. I had a lot of energy to burn, and I don't know if that was because I was more adrenalized, so I felt like I could just like run the world, because for some reason vegans and running go hand in hand.
Yeah, they very much seem to.
Yeah.
Like, marathons, triathlons, all of that.
I was training for a marathon. And
typical vegan.
I don't know if it's because we eat plants, we have to prove our toughness, but anyway. So when I started introducing meat back into my diet, I felt great. That was like the best way. I felt like everything slowed down. But it took about a week, and then once everything regulated, I actually felt, the best way I can describe it is whole. Like now I feel complete, whereas when I was vegan, I always felt maybe a little bit hungry, maybe a little bit like nervous. Now I feel like solid and strong and grounded, eating milk and meat and things like that.
Jen doesn't drink milk.
No.
She eats fish. Eats it.
Did I say eat it?
Yeah.
You know
Said
what?
it twice now.
Oh, did I?
And I was
it's because, what are you doing? Because I really hate the taste of milk. Ugh, it's so gross. So I have to drink it like either in coffee or chocolate milk, or I just eat a lot of ice cream. So I eat.
Well, let's move in a little further into the movie here, right? Okay, the cool part is they talk about genetics. So this is one of the good parts of this movie.
Did you like what they had to say about that?
I did like what they had to say about genetics because, the medical industry nowadays, we're all told by doctors that it's just a genetic thing, and so when the word genetics comes up, what that really means is, stuff I can't control, right? Because your genetics and your genetic code and your DNA, whatever is written into it, that's what you're going to deal with in life, right? Okay, but then there are others who started talking about this concept of gene expression. So yeah, there are good parts to your genes and bad parts to your genes, and if you're healthy, you can express the good parts, and if you're not healthy, then yes, you'll fall into the illnesses that you're probably predisposed to. But again, as I like to say, genetics isn't really what you should be concerned about, because your physiology is the platform from which you play out your genetics, right? So yes, if you have a healthy lifestyle, and again, we're only talking about this the whole movie is just talking about diet in relationship to the things that impact your body, whereas there's so many other things: your environment, your mental state.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's another conversation that we'll probably get into a little bit more. But at least from a genetic standpoint, there was a point in time, I think, and Mae Wan Ho talks about this. She talks about it, I think, a little bit in the documentary that everybody has to watch called On the Back of a Tiger when it comes out. But there's a great little, I think it was like a 4-video series, an interview of Mae Wan Ho, who is a well-known kind of alternative thinker within the genetics world, who talks about this time, I think it was during the 80s or 90s, where there was just this flood of doctors and scientists leaving the world, the field of genetics, because they started to realize, it's not what we thought it was. It's not like this code that if we can figure out how to treat it and figure out how to medicate or whatever. They started to realize that everything about your DNA can change, even the sequences of the double helix. So, and it changes in response to your environment. So,
to say
that
this is genetics, or
you're bound by your genes is
you
is
always
false.
You will have heart disease because
and they talk about that in the movie. So that's always, I've always talked about that, because maybe I'm a little bit of a rebel, but I don't like the idea at all whatsoever of being controlled by anything, which is probably why I run my own business. I can't work for other people very well. It takes very patient people like Jenn to be able to deal with me.
I just tune you out.
Oh. That makes more sense. Right? But I thought it was a good part. What did you think about the genetics part?
You know what? I was still telling them often. At that point, I had enough doubt what they were saying. I was just kind of upset.
I mean, because you knew what they were going to say after that, right? They're going to get right back into the
so I was just
on
like
the vegan train. Yeah.
I was just pouting at that point.
Yeah. Well, then they moved on to the American, I think this is Cancer Association, or I can't remember exactly which. But they started talking about the different types of proteins. They started talking about fish, right? Which I think is also another good thing to discuss, because there are very different levels of quality in fish. You have farmed fish, you have wild-caught fish. Farmed fish are really not handled well.
Yeah, it's
Not
gross.
at all.
And I mean, and just like anything, like you had mentioned it before, it's like, okay, if you're going to get pasture raised beef or eggs or whatever, I guess they're not pasture raised eggs, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, pasture raised, yeah. Because if the chickens are pasture raised, then the eggs are too.
The contaminants like in the air and the soil, you're never, even if you're buying organic, you're never fully going to get rid of the crap that's going on in the world today. But when you're doing fish, trying to get a wild-caught fish and staying away from, foods like salmon. That I was happy.
Fish.
That was something that I was happy that they brought up. They were like, okay, foods that you think are good for you, like salmon and tuna,
right.
They're not so great for you.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't specifically go into why, and I wish they would have, about the type of fat and
right, because they just talk about
mercury.
how salmon has a ton of fat, but then they don't ever go into the 3 different fats.
Yeah, and they wanted to demonize saturated fat.
They wanted to clump it all together.
That's still real big. But I did like that part. The thing is, when you're already over, I mean, we kind of talked about this already a little bit, but when you are a person who is probably eating fast food, not exercising, you're gaining weight, you're very stationary, you're probably very stressed, to now you have hope and you're excited, and now you're going to completely shift your diet, like change your environment, and then you're already eating healthy, so now you're going to want to exercise more. You're already going to start to lose weight, and really to help with not being diabetic, just losing weight will reverse it makes a big difference. Will reverse the diagnosis anyway.
Yeah, less fat on your body will completely change your hormonal profile.
So to say that a plant-based diet can get rid of diabetes, I don't think is the right thing to say.
Right, because a meat-based, I guess you could say, or a diet with meat in it, let's not say meat-based, right? But a diet with meat in it can also reverse diabetes. I mean, we've had people in here who we would have drink a lot of milk. They would have small portions of red meats. They would also eat things like liver. They would have stuff like bone broth soups. And we've gotten them to reverse their diabetes also. And even when they're very advanced into their, type 2 diabetes. So, you have
to look at the whole situation.
Right. And when people go on vegan diets in general, a lot of the time, they lose a lot of weight, but they lose a lot of everything else also.
Yeah.
So, and, that statement might be a little too blanketed for some people. But really, I mean, I've worked with people who were vegans in the past, and very commonly I found long-term veganism results in things like multiple sclerosis. MS is one of the more common ones. I'd say in the handful of vegans that I've worked with, 80% of them were with MS. Vegans that were long-term.
Yeah, long-term.
So, and it's not like they came to me because they were like, I killed myself with veganism. They just were not feeling well. They had MS. They came to us because they said, hey, we've heard that you have a background in neurology, and so I got this brain thing, and I'm like, yeah, let's change your diet up, and they're like, oh, okay,
Yeah, things got better.
because at that point they're willing to try something new.
Yeah. They said something about a lot of the big industries now that they use doubt as their product,
right,
and confusion as their game, and this is probably a bold statement, whatever, but
go, Jen, do it.
Documentaries like this, I feel that's what they use.
Right. I thought that was a little hypocritical.
I was like,
right?
but I was sitting there and I had doubt and confusion. I was
Right.
like, what's going on? My world felt, turned upside down again. And I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because they didn't give you all the information and all the facts.
So what they really proved is the same
Method, I guess?
Method, thank you. The same method that these evil industries use, like the tobacco industry and the meat industries, to create confusion and doubt, is the same thing that they were essentially doing. But they'll portray that as just kind of telling you the truth,
Yeah.
But again, it can't be just truth if there are so many other variables that's missing from this picture. So, I could see what they were coming. Every one of them there are vegan, and then they started interviewing people who are super, super sick, and then they're like, all right, vegan diet for 2 weeks, and their diabetes and their pain and the hip replacements that this woman had to have because she was bone on bone in 2 weeks.
Gone.
All gone.
But this person was probably had hope. Her mind, her mental, her mindset changed. She probably wasn't and then she got off her meds, all those meds.
Right.
So just getting off the meds themselves, she's not going to be dealing with the side effects.
Right. So let's lay this out for everybody so they understand what was going on in the movie.
We're jumping around.
They interview, I believe, about 3 people. One was a man who was terribly diabetic and had the big pot belly and was on a plethora of medication. Then there was a woman who was walking around with a walker at 61 years old. She had also a plethora of medication, from everything from blood pressure to statin drugs to narcotics for pain, you name it. And then there was who's the other one that they interviewed?
I just remember the woman and the guy.
There was a third one, but that's all you need right now, right? Those 2.
Yeah.
So both of them on a vegan diet, after 2 weeks, they said they were able to get off all of their medication. I think the diabetic guy, was almost off all his medication. And they were up and moving around and more active all of a sudden, purely because they ate beans, broccoli, and brown rice. Because that's really all they talked about. And I'm like, well, a lot of things happen when people decide to become healthier. First, they're focusing on an outcome that is hopeful, that it makes them happy. It gives them energy all of a sudden to want to do something. And then, yes, they go on a diet, which we could say can force their body to become very adrenalized because it will throw off your blood sugar levels, which we don't have to prove. You can test by checking your heart rates and temperature, which is one of the things that Jenn here did when she was vegan, vegetarian at the time.
I was low.
And then you were starting to take heart rates and temperatures, and you started to realize the numbers kept splitting, which means that you were experiencing an adrenal production. So if you're experiencing an adrenal production, all that means is, again, that your body probably had gone low in blood sugar, and you had to start making adrenaline and other stress hormone to regulate your blood sugar, and that is a process that leads to degeneration over time. And all of the stuff that they're talking about that causes cancer. We are encouraging you to do your own research, but we've been at this or at least I've been at this for a really long time now. And because I've tried so many different things, and I've run into major roadblocks, I thought when I was paleo, that was going to be the end all. Like, I figured it out. This paleo thing really makes sense. And then I adjusted it slightly with Paul Gimenez's Perfect Health Diet, which was, the reintroduction of more saturated fat and less unsaturated fat. But he also still demonized sugar. And I thought, you know what, this seems to be the right way. And man, did I have some serious health issues, which I've discussed so many times in some of the other videos. But yeah, the pain, the hair loss, the skin issues, the low energy, the moodiness. People would have thought that I was on high amounts of steroids because I'd flip out. I flip out all the time. Really now I realize it was probably just from being hyperadrenal and really highly estrogenic, right? From having a very low sugar diet and high protein and fat diet. Well, let's go further on to it, right? So yeah, we already hit the lactose intolerance thing. Then, which really does make me think more and more about the meat that we eat, because not that I think that meat is bad still at this point, but the way that we are handling livestock, it's such a sad thing. Like in South Carolina, how they showed all of these different houses with pig livestock, and how they essentially
get rid of the waste.
How they get rid of the waste. They just essentially just pipeline it down into a little pond, which is a piss and shit urine pond, or they spray it back into over the crops that they'll eventually feed the animals to. And then when the animals died, how they go and they pretty much just mince them up and feed them back to the pigs. Yeah, I mean, pork is not what it used to be. Yeah, and they're fed soy and grain, which that's going to cause issues.
I have, meat because of the way it's handled, and I personally don't want to eat a lot of meat. I do fine with a high dairy, getting my protein from dairy. I still eat meat, but definitely not as much as I used to. And that's what's nice about when you really learn how the body works and how your body works, right? Because everyone has different backgrounds, and when you find out what works for your body, it's like, okay, cool. If I don't want to eat that much meat, I don't have to. I can get protein from other sources. I like it.
I like saying that too, and everybody else says that too. But something I always try to ask myself, and I want to ask you this question, because whenever somebody says that, I want to say, well, how do you judge what works for you?
I take my heart rate and temp.
Okay, so heart rate and temperature, right?
Yeah.
That is probably one of the biggest tools that we use here, and really, in one sense, it's kind of the end-all be-all when you want to test things out.
And when you've been doing that for a couple years, it doesn't even take even a couple years when you eat something, you wait, or you'll know in about 10 to 15 minutes whether that was okay for your body. Because there's some things that I'll eat, or combinations, and I'll feel kind of like really tired. Because there's sometimes you eat foods.
Or swollen.
Yeah,
just bloated.
But I do really well with dairy, which is funny because I grew up being taught that I was lactose intolerant.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the amount of dairy that you're able to consume now, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I have no problem at all. So.
All right. Well, they then went into the American Cancer Society talk. This is now when they started to talk about the sponsors, right? The American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, they went through all of this, and they started to show them the guy Googling, sponsor, right? And, they were sponsored by Kraft, which, if you didn't know, bought out the tobacco industry too. But they didn't say anything like that. They just said, Kraft, and I think it was like the meat packing industry and all of that, and they would just say, see, they're sponsored by dairy and meat. They're sponsored by a whole bunch of other things too, but they just listed those.
He's talking about like the American Cancer Society,
right?
And like
the American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, and so I thought that was also another way of just narrowing down into just revealing information that they want to reveal, in the documentary. And then they had this point in time where they remember that where they're trying to have an interview in one of the hospitals, and I forget where, and the media representative came out and said, look, we could talk about diet, but honestly, and we said we would talk about it, but we do also know that it could impact the procedures and surgeries that we do here,
the business,
and that's that's our bottom line here. And if it's going to impact our bottom line, then honestly, we're not willing to
have the interview,
have that talk, because the hospital is a business also, and that this is where we could get into talks about capitalism versus socialism or whatever. But I'm all about having as much freedom as possible, right? To be able to run my own business, make my money, etc., pursue a happy life. But then there are things like this where that it's the capitalistic nature of this country that has put us in this situation, which isn't necessarily just this country. Yeah, America's a big part of it, but everywhere in the world, people are trying to make as much money as they possibly can at whatever cost. But that's the difficult part about this when I think about it, right? At least from that political standpoint.
Ethics, I guess.
Yeah, do I want to be, the communist country and be like, you look like a good shoemaker, go make shoe. That's your whole life. No. But I think that there's got to be some sort of better regulation here. I think most people know the truth. But again, with the creation of all of this doubt and confusion, people just throw their hands up and saying, how could I possibly control something that big?
Yeah. Well, and I don't know. There's only going to be so much you can when big business runs everything.
Yeah. So FitLife Fusion will become the biggest of all businesses, and we'll just shut them all down.
Take on the livestock companies.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I don't know if we'll shut them all down, but you guys can help us figure it out when we get there. All right. So we're probably approaching the end of this now, right? The ADA chief interview, what is that? The American Diabetic Association.
Yeah. He got heated.
Yeah, and who knows how much of that interview they actually showed, right?
Oh yeah, that's true.
Because all they did is cut right to the scene where they start asking about a diet question, which then this guy immediately gets heated. Who knows how long they were in that room for, but the guy didn't do himself any favors by getting so pissed off by saying all diets work if you follow them, or and again, this is the chief director of the American Diabetic Association, and they went in there asking questions by saying, hey, here are all these studies that we researched, why don't you have warnings about meat and this and that on here? And then the guy gets pissed off, walks out of the room, ends the interview, and then they go on to talk about the sponsors of the American Diabetic Association, which, this meat and this company that makes Velveeta cheese and
A big sponsor. But that's what he kind of asked for it though. When he ended that interview, you're gonna get hit.
Oh yeah, he definitely did. He didn't do it in a very not with couth. That was for sure.
I thought this was interesting. It brought out that doctors nowadays have about 7 hours of nutrition counseling every few years. They'll kind of take a nutrition class.
I don't remember hearing that part. Yeah, I didn't at least remember hearing the statistic.
Yeah,
the number.
And I was like, ooh.
Yeah, I think it's not very commonly known that doctors going through medical school get next to no, if not completely zero, credit hours toward nutrition. Because the medical field, really, and I remember talking to somebody who worked in the medical field, or at least with them in a consulting position. And I said to him that medicine is not science. Medicine is the business of science. And he was like,
how dare you?
How could you say that? You're telling me medicine is not science? And I'm saying, yes, medicine is not science. It is the sales, it is the sales department, right, of science in that way. So they discuss it in there, which can, again, go either way in their argument. The studies that pretty much almost every study you can find, the true way to figure out whether it is biased or not is to figure out who sponsored it, who funded the study. And many, many studies that support, saturated fat are, yes, going to be funded by the dairy industry or meat industry or whatever, and then vice versa. A lot of the studies that show that polyunsaturated fat and margarine and corn oil, which are also made from the crops that are domestically grown here in the States. So it'd be nice, to say that those are good, because then we here in this country make more money, right? Not that matters. But the point is that all of these studies are funded by somebody trying to prove a point to be able to sell something. at least the majority of them. And a lot of them that aren't don't ever even make the journals.
Yeah.
I don't think people realize that. I don't think people realize that there are tons of studies that are done in good faith and,
Well, the more studies that I've been
that
looking
are peer
into,
reviewed, et cetera, but then they don't get into journals.
Yeah.
Purely because it's not going to support any of these major moneymakers. So they get muffled out.
Or even those studies can be inconclusive. I did a blog on edema and high blood pressure, and the main study, one of the main studies that they used to prove that salt was the culprit, it wasn't even a really controlled study. I think if it wasn't backed by the certain organization, it would have been thrown out or start over at least because it was inaccurate.
Yeah, and sometimes studies can be done 9, 10, 11, 12 times, and they're waiting for that one time that they get the result that they wanted to, portray the message that they want to portray, and then they'll say, boom, there we go, and they publish that one, and that's it. Not the other 9 times that it failed or proven the the opposite. So studies, aren't always just the end all be all. All right. And then I also thought, which something I didn't really know much about, is these government-funded programs within the fast food industry.
Oh yeah, I know. I wrote that down.
Yeah, they talked about how McDonald's has a staff of 6 people, at least 6 that they know of, who are on a salary payroll in order to just come up with ideas of how the company can make more money from the food industries that support them the most. So they're talking about how cheese, right? The Domino's stuffed crust, cheese pizza. So it's cheese on the pizza, extra cheese, stuffed crust with more cheese in it. And that's a way that they're able to help the dairy industry push more of their product.
Yeah.
And then they'll end up getting money from that, right? So
it's kind of gross.
I've never, I first of all, it's the first I've ever heard of anything like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes sense, of course, from this corporate standpoint to figure out more ways to make more money. And if this other company or industry is going to be more inclined to give us more money in order for us to change our products, then it's just another way to support the corporate greed, right? Yeah. So that I thought was kind of crazy.
Yeah.
And I never heard anything of that before.
Well, it just, I mean, now when you see, they even had it on there, like the Baconator. You have bacon on top of beef and you have extra, craziness. It was just like, okay, that's behind that.
Right, bacon wrapped in bacon, covered with cheese.
Wrapped with bacon.
Deep fried in bacon fat. Right? All of that. So, so that was another interesting thing that I can't comment too much on because I don't know enough about it. And then they really went into pharma, big pharma. And if you think about it, something that people don't talk about a lot when it comes to the pharmaceutical industries is how many pharmaceutical drugs are sold to the food industry to give to the livestock.
Yeah.
Right? It's almost as big of a business. I think it's a smaller business. I don't want to say it's bigger.
I hope it's
but
smaller.
I hope it's smaller. But it's almost as big of a business as it is in medicating people. We're being medicated by the pharmaceutical companies through the foods that we're eating without us ever being prescribed a drug.
Yeah.
And that's almost scarier than almost anything else that we heard in this. I think they said there were over 435 drugs approved by I think it was maybe the FDA. Yeah,
you can, in one piece of meat, you can find 4 or 5 different types of medicine.
Right, medicines, hormones, things like that. And they don't have to label any of this stuff. Yeah, so, and that's not talking about the toxins in the air, the greenhouse gases, the methane, and all of that ends up coming down and covering the land, and then the animals eat that. Now we're just talking about the 435 different things that they can pump the animal full of without having to tell us.
Yeah.
And we're the test subjects because that's not regulated whatsoever either. And if it is regulated, it's regulated by the same body that profits off of it. So, right?
Highly suspect.
Highly
suspect.
That's right.
It's kind of gross.
Yeah. Well,
makes you want to go eat.
These guys, they were very anti-paleo, very anti-milk, dairy, broccoli, brown rice, and what was the other one? Beans. Right. Which we've already had a discussion about, right? Too much fiber in the human gut, not really a good thing. Plants themselves, not very digestible. Brown rice, right? The only difference between brown rice and white rice is the hull over the rice, which is difficult for our guts to break down. And remember, in order for fibers to be digested, it has to go through a fermentation process, which our gut is not necessarily designed to, at least as Dr. Ray Peat likes to say. And therefore, this fermentation process can cause more and more lactic acid, and acidity is the problem, right? So, yeah.
Well, it's like, okay, if you're already dealing with a gut issue, like if you can't break down dairy, how in the world are you going to be able to break down pulp?
Right.
You know?
Wood pulp, essentially, right? Cellulose, which is also added into things more and more. Yeah, so they really just started losing credibility when they started talking about how lower blood pressure and pulse and lower cholesterol levels is really great. How the vegan diet makes cholesterol numbers plummet, and I was like, well, yeah, but we've also proven that when you
lower cholesterol,
you really increase mortality rate of, yes, maybe not so much heart disease, but every other reason for mortality. Right? Well, I think that do you have anything else you want to cap this off, Jen, with anything?
It just made me, I am comfortable knowing, after watching that documentary, I was like, you know what, I am satisfied with just taking my heart rate and temp, going off by how I feel, you know, after I eat something.
Energy, bloat, swelling.
Yeah.
Right, sleep.
That's
skin, hair, libido, like all of those things are all things that you can self-assess.
Yeah, whether or not you have a healthy metabolism, and I'm comfortable with that.
Yeah. And I feel personally more empowered, right? You know, in control of my own health, because I now have these tools, whereas every other diet is just like, well, how do you feel? And I'm like, well, I feel great, but I also feel like, you know,
like a gazelle.
Yeah.
being,
that's
kind of how I feel.
Like I also feel wired and freaked out all the time and sweating my ass off in the middle of the night, and you know, these were all the things that happened when I was on the paleo diet. But I read those books and I was like, this is great info. Now I follow more of the approach of, well, okay, now I can read it, try to come to an understanding of it, and then test it. Whereas the paleo diet and all these other diets didn't offer any certain self-assessment or test, you know?
Yeah.
Heart rates and temperatures, understanding where those are supposed to be for a healthy human being. And then also notice the correlation of how these low temps and low pulses of the hundreds of people that walk through our door on an annual basis, where they're at. They all fit that same mold.
Yeah, I like how you put that. That's kind of how I feel. I feel like I'm in more control now because I have more tools.
Yeah.
I know more about my body. More, you know, you're more informed. Knowledge is power.
Knowledge. All right, guys. Well, that is it. I guess to cap this off, I give this a very low rating when it comes to, you know, I give it like a solid 1.5 out of 5 stars. Right?
It's just another.
Yeah.
Another stereotypical
It's another
documentary.
propagandized.
That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, almost cultish type vegan commercial. Yeah. And again, I'm not against vegans. I don't judge you for being vegan if you are. But what I am saying is, I feel like the vegan world is full of blind loyalty. Right?
Yeah.
Would you say
that
so,
was
Jen?
me. That was me.
Yeah. blind loyalty.
Speaking for myself, yeah, that was me.
Mm-hmm. And so that's when I really question, a diet or a method or whatever. Jen, how many stars out of 5 would you give this one, Jen?
A 2.
2 stars. You rated it higher than I was, and you were hating on
I
it way
know,
more.
I was all mad. I learned some stuff in it, though. How the life. I knew.
But that whole thing about South Carolina.
Yeah, that
watch
was like,
that
oh
part.
my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the whole the federally funded, how some
food
of the
programs.
Food programs, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did learn some stuff.
Yes, I could adjust it and say I'll give it like a 2, 2.5 or something like that. But definitely not something that I highly recommend that you watch.
Yeah.
No, not really.
I think it would confuse you.
Yeah, absolutely. But more information, the better. And again, do your own research, test out your own things. Don't take what we have said here today in this probably about 1 hour as doctrine. And, go out and figure out what's going to work for you. If we can help you, we're here to provide you with information so you can make some of your own educated decisions.
Yeah.
But that's it. Okay. So I think we can call it right there, huh, John?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, again, my name's Peter Pinto.
And I'm Jennifer Davis.
And hopefully we've left you with some heavy thoughts. We'll see you next time.